Thank you. Thank you, and good morning. I'd like to open up the session today by talking around something positive. And I think it's a wonderful time to be in the networking business right now. I've been in the industry for over 30 years, and I've never been more excited than I am right now to be in the network business, because we have an enormous amount of opportunity in front of us. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to really not focus so much on the technologies. I think there are people more capable of that in this room than I am. But I'm going to try and provide some business context around the history of the industry and the structure, because I think it's important that we understand what's gone on if we're going to predict with any great clarity around what's going to happen in the future. But the one thing I want to leave you with is that the network matters again. Now, it's always mattered to us, hopefully, but what I'm really talking about is the distribution of value and the amount of value that we can accrue to this industry and to the network specifically. And I think we have enormous opportunities to do that. So first of all, let me talk about the network, and more specifically, where has it been for the last 5 to 10 years? It's played absolutely a critical role, that's for sure. But I'd put to you, it has not actually been the starring role. The starring role from a business point of view are the content providers, who've accrued so far most of the value in this brave new world that we've been creating over the last 10 to 15 years. The good news is, I think we have the opportunity to accrue back some of that value into a more shared ecosystem as the industry develops. And I feel very positive that we can do that. But we are going to require to take on a lot of change in the industry to truly realize the value creation opportunity in front of us. Before I go there, let's sort of give some global perspective around what we've all gone through in the last decade or so. An enormous amount of fast and tumultuous change. You know, any generation that you talk to will say the same thing. You know, they all say that that was an enormous amount of change went on, and they're probably absolutely right. But that change is increasing, and I think the three primary elements that are coming together to increase the velocity of this change are massive trends in themselves: globalization, modernization, and of course the thing that's most the focus of the people in this room today, innovation. And the relationship between these three things over the last decade, the interworking of them, has caused an enormous amount of change. And if you think about globalization and modernization specifically, it's really provided a very large market and an enormous appetite for innovation. You know, most easily personified as the thing we call the internet. And that really is bringing about enormous change and opportunity on a global basis. And if I reflect on that from an innovation perspective, the two basic elements of innovation that enabled the growth of the internet were two things. One was discrete and somewhat infinite addressing, although we've had to address that a couple of times, that really gave discrete addresses to everything that we can scale up. The second element was what I'm calling limitless capacity. And really, when you think about limitless capacity, principally DWDM-type technologies of fiber and optics have enabled enormous scale of the internet. And the three observations I would have about this are as follows. Number one, this graph shows the reduction in gigabit, price per gigabit over the last few years and the projections further out. So we've taken the cost down dramatically. And in some cases, depending on how you do the analysis, actually faster than Moore's law. And many people in this room take credit for that. The second thing that we've done as an industry is actually provide enormous amounts of capacity, scalable capacity, 2.5 gig, now to 40 gig, to 100 gig, and beyond. So we've enabled a lot of the things that have gone on. But the third thing is a little more subtle, and I think is really the profound business consequence of what we've done. Who in the room was in this industry in 2003? Okay. I think most of the industry, most of the folks in the room. Now, if you recall at that time, we had a capacity glut that we were told by very smart economists and business people that it would take our whole lifetime to actually use. So we'd overbuilt, sort of the first coming of the internet, if you will, and without any real business models, and we'd overbuilt enormous amounts of capacity, be it, submarine, terrestrial, metro, just way more capacity than we'd ever really needed. Well, how do we feel about that now? What that really facilitated, in my opinion, was the elasticity of the price and demand that enabled real business models to be developed for the internet. And the content providers took that opportunity. The likes of Google, the likes of Amazon, the likes of Facebook. They took that business dynamic, this oversupply of capacity, this abundance of capacity at seemingly low cost, and they created the business models that we see today through advertising, etc. So we're in a very strong position going forward in terms of the value creation that is the internet. The issue is who shares in that going forward. And we created that opportunity and that business model from the underpinnings of the innovation that we had. And as an industry, not everybody made this journey in the last 10 to 15 years. And we've seen many changes in the industry structure, and I'll touch on that in a couple of slides further on. But the point really is that we made enormous investments in the technology and the innovation that have facilitated this. That really is the point. And the leveraging of that innovation has given rise to what we're seeing now, a connected planet, increasingly. Enormous amounts of data stored in the cloud, wirelessly accessed, smart devices increasing every day. That was facilitated by a lot of the innovation from the folks in this room. But I'd put to you that the stars of the show so far have actually been around content. And really, if you look underneath that, it was the trend to virtualization of computing and storage that have underpinned this connected planet, using, of course, the network, but somewhat in a supporting role. Now, this trend for virtualization, which allows access from everything, everywhere, essentially, has really just been limited to those two areas. So, guess what I think the next logical step is for virtualization? The good news for everybody in this room, I think it's the network. And I'm going to tell you why I think it's the network and why the opportunity is now. Because without the underpinnings of the network creating the right capacity at the right time, at the right place, with the right characteristics, we're not going to realize the ambition of a truly, truly connected planet. Three elements to this need to be considered. And I think, essentially, I talked about change in the industry. I think we need to completely turn upside down our concept of the network. We think about the network as being an infrastructure. We build the network and they will come. I'd encourage us to think entirely differently. Let's start with the end users. Let's start with the end users' behaviors. Then we will learn about how to truly accrue value for the network. And if you think about what's going on, it's really about an application-centric end user. We see this in our own, daily lives. This is now moving into enterprise. Cloud is really becoming a reality. And as enterprises move to cloud, the experience that they have from an application point of view is enormously impacted by the network. It's such a large part of the user experience. And the user experience, they don't care whether it's over Wi-Fi, they don't care whether it's over fiber, they don't care whether you're bouncing it off the moon. When they get on that application and they want the information, they just expect it to be there. They don't care over which medium does it come. And we're at the fairly early stages of this. The iPad is less than 4 years old. And I put to you that that's when all this really, really started. And you think about the impact of this in a fairly short space of time. So we need to understand what's going on with the end users. We can no longer be buried in the infrastructure. We have to understand service creation. We have to understand the ability for our customers to create new services in hours and minutes, not months and years. Total inversion of how we've historically built networks. The second element to achieve this, and this is getting a lot of discussion now in the context of, things like SDN and NFV, but is really essentially openness. And if we're going to be able to control the network from applications instead of from the infrastructure, we need an open architecture. So the interfaces, the APIs are actually connected to each other, and you can pass the intelligence and the controls and the commands around the network to control the infrastructure. A fundamental change in how we do things. And lastly, and I think critically, it's about an ecosystem. And it's about an equal partnership, if you like, with compute and store. So you need to have access to the information, you need to know where it is, you need to be able to get it down through the network. All three elements need to be working tightly aligned and in an ecosystem. The other point I would make is no one company has the ability to deliver all of this. Everybody is going to be required to play nicely, which is not something that we've seen historically, but both in our industry and certainly within compute and storage. But if we don't create an ecosystem of openness, we will not be able to deliver this. So this is our opportunity, from a network point of view, to be an equal partner, to virtualize the network, to be able to realize the ambition of supporting the end user applications, and that will drive the network. That will also drive the value that accrues to the network. This is our opportunity for a seat at the table. We've been in a supporting role for too long. This concept of the network basically being just the plumbing for the internet, I've never particularly subscribed to. It is such a fundamental part of the end user experience, it can no longer be relegated to the thoughts of just plumbing and capacity. It is way more than that, and it needs to be. So what does all this mean for the people in this room? I've talked very conceptually so far. Let me try and get a little more specific. Firstly, from an architectural point of view, and these are things that I think everybody in the room will agree with, but we need to build networks differently. High degree of convergence of packet optical, much more intelligence on the network, programmability and openness, and have enormous amount of analytics so we can see what's going on with end user behavior and change the network accordingly. And let me be really clear about this. This is not about incremental change. If you're thinking that what I'm talking about is moving from 100 gig to 400 gig, think broader. This is a different way to build a network. It's not just a shift from SONET SDH to a converged network with multi-service. Yes, it is that, but it is much more than that. It's about putting programmability and intelligence onto the network. The industry structure. We've seen a lot of changes over the last few years. And this concept, which we all grew up with, this sort of end-to-end concept, I would put to you is fundamentally flawed, and you're seeing that in the industry changes of the last few years. What do I mean by that? This industry was really created by spin-offs of the equipment arms from the phone companies. And most of the time, they did everything for the phone companies, right? They built the handsets, they built the switches, they did absolutely everything. And this was our mindset of how the industry and people were going to buy. It's proven to be incorrect. And I'd put to you that going forward, it's more about industry specialists, large players that have scale, make no mistake, but players that are focused in the area of number 1 or 2 or 3 in the world, playing nicely in a set of ecosystems in an open architecture with other players. No one player can be all of these things. This concept of end-to-end, I think, is fundamentally flawed and doesn't certainly apply to the forward structure of the industry. But tight collaboration and people playing nicely. There will be winners and losers in this. For sure. That's what life's about. It's about creating opportunity as we go through change, and those will either embrace it and move or not. Just because you've got a seat at the table right now doesn't mean to say you'll have a seat at the table in 3 to 5 years' time. Because the skill sets required to, compete in 2 to 3 years will be different. And so I think you're going to see a lot of change in the industry. But fundamentally, it's a great opportunity. And we are very well positioned to do this. But it's going to require an awful lot of work. Now, I've talked so far a lot about, the industry as being sort of the optical type industry. Let me talk a little bit about our customers, the service operators around the world. Now, if we make the changes that I'm talking about, getting closer to the end user and service creation and what's going on the network, that will create a lot more business value that we're bringing to our customers. And let's be honest about this, there's some fundamental business questions and major challenges to our customers that are going on right now. They're fundamental. And the first one is who captures and monetizes the value? And how do they accrue more value back to the network? Someone's got to pay for all of the technology that we're developing and the delivery of this and the customer experience. What's the balance in the ecosystem of that? And yet content is absolutely driving a lot of the need for the network. These are major business issues. Who's a customer and who is competition? In this ecosystem, it can be the same person. And how do they use the enormous amounts of data to better the end user experience? We know they've got the opportunity to do that. How can we help them do it? And lastly, but not least, how do they break down these closed vendor end-to-end type environments and open up the network for greater innovation? We don't have all the answers to all of these, obviously. But we have the opportunity to provide a lot more than we're providing right now. And that is exactly what we need to do. And again, I go back to this point of, I'm not talking about incremental change here. It is absolutely necessary but not sufficient that we continue to drive innovation and the technology that we've delivered, as I've illustrated to you, over the last few years. That's a given. But we've got to put more intelligence onto the network. It's true transformation. This is not incremental change. Therefore, it is a large opportunity for us. And I think we really have the opportunity to do that. And as I sort of think about conceptually, how would I summarize this? It's really transforming capacity, which is something that we know and love and work with every day, into capability. That's really what this is about if we're going to realize the value in front of us. Not just thinking about capacity in terms of moving bits, but capability in terms of what we do with those bits. You know, it's the old adage, if you just move bits, you're going to get a certain amount of value. If you do something with them, you're more likely to get a little more value. So turning capacity into capability. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So with a telephone and a credit card this morning, I can order up immediately compute and storage. You know, Amazon. I could do that over the phone. You know the thing I can't do? I can't get the connectivity. Strikes me as an opportunity. Simple example. Secondly, I go back to the iPad. We've got to make the network as programmable as an iPad, as simple as an application. It's got to be driven in that simple form, not just from the end user, but how we actually control the network. It cannot take over a year to develop a new service. That's too long. It's got to be driven from the application. And this is conceptually what I think we have to have in mind as an industry. And lastly, I think perhaps most importantly, it's a mindset of us in the industry. We've got to think about capacity in terms of real capability and capability that we can actually deliver into the marketplace. So yes, we've absolutely got to continue on this curve of capacity. Don't get me wrong, 400 gig, 1 terabit and beyond. Absolutely. Critical. But it's not the only thing that we need to deliver here. It's not, if we're going to change our place and accrue more value to the network. As I said, I think it is a wonderful, wonderful time to be in this industry. You should embrace the challenge. It's never been more exciting. And the opportunity in front of us is to make the network matter even more. Thank you.